The word Victorian has come to mean a lot of different things in today's world. Today, it means stuffy, prudish, hypocritical, maybe overly judgmental. And that's as opposed to its original meaning, which was during the reign of Queen Victoria. So today, if we call somebody Victorian, it's typically not a very flattering term, but that's the connotation that it's taken on over time. Here's a photo of Queen Victoria with Prince Albert and a reproduction of a portrait done of Queen Victoria when she was quite young. She ascended to the throne at age 18, if you can imagine that at such a young age. So, what was going on in the Victorian era? Well, a lot of you are familiar with the term Industrial Revolution. That was creating what felt like great rapid change to people living through it. People were leaving the farms, leaving the villages, going to work in factories, looking for a better life. Uh, What this meant was that men, women, and children, sometimes as young as 9 years old, worked in factories that were noisy, dirty, dangerous, and they were making products for heavy industry, consumers, and so on. So child labor was quite common, and I think we saw evidence of that in the chimney sweeper poems. Eventually, some laws were passed within the 19th century to limit hours and limit ages somewhat, but you still had teenagers, instead of going to school, working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week for very low pay. And if you were unfortunate enough to be injured on the job or in any other part of life, the outlook was grim for you. You might be sent to debtor's prison, and it's pretty hard to work off your debt when you can't work because you're in prison, or the poorhouse, something like that. Some of the products that they were making, just to give you an idea, uh, heavy stuff like iron, steel, machinery. They're making locomotives, they're making roof tiles, bricks. And as far as consumer products, England, as you may know, they raise a lot of sheep and they make wool from the fibers, and that was exported all around the world. England also imported cotton from the United States and made cloth from that and clothes from that. Then you have the everyday items like soap, matches, boots and gloves. Uh, if you're familiar with the leather making process, that's very dangerous with a lot of chemicals. And tiny things like buttons for hats, clay tobacco pipes, those types of things. Also, for the Victorian kitchen, they're making pots, crockery, porcelain, they're making furniture, and they're making gas to power the gas lights. Something that bears on what we're studying is printers' presses. They're making newspapers and books. Within the Victorian period, there are a lot of paradoxes and contradictions. A lot of people made a lot of money. And depending on your point of view, you might call those people robber barons or captains of industry. So there was a lot of potential for good here, but unfortunately, the people at the top that had the industries that we just mentioned didn't share with their workers. Let's put it that way. So that's the extreme upper class. And then there's the aristocracy, of course, that had a lot of inherited wealth. When we get to the middle class, we've got people that are merchants that run a store or a lot of stores, we have factory owners, managers, and so on, professional people. Most of the people making money in the middle class are men, but not always. There were women that were also store managers that were professionals. The lower class tends to mean the factory workers that we mentioned, and they had very much inadequate housing. They were lucky if they could afford enough to eat, and typically it wasn't always the most healthy food. For all classes, they share this in common, that disease and early death were an everyday occurrence. Children didn't often, Children often did die before they reached adulthood. Women died in childbirth. There were many orphanages. And one heartbreaking thing that I read about this was that many people raised their children to be polite and to get along in the event that they were orphaned, that they were well behaved enough that a family member would take them in and not send them to an orphanage. So if you can imagine your prospects being that bleak, that happened to you as a child. It's not all doom and gloom, though. People still need distraction. There were a rise in leisure activities. Um, there, people visited beaches, they collected fossils. Collection was kind of a mania during the Victorian time, where people had cabinets where they kept their special finds or their little bits of porcelain or shells that they picked up on the beach. There was the Crystal Palace exhibition, which was kind of like a what we think of a World's Fair expo, um, that was super popular. People went to see plays, they went hunting and fishing with their friends. There were professional associations, there were men's clubs. Wealthy teenage girls were presented at court, which is like what we would call a debutante or a debutante ball today. So there were leisure activities, and even for the poorest people, there were parks that they could go through and try to get a little dose of nature into their lives. So there was stress on the Victorian people. I don't think any generation escaped stress, do they? Family life changed. So if you moved to town and you left your extended family in the country, that meant that you lost the support that you might have been used to from your extended family. Grandparents, if they lived to that age, often in the country would watch over the children, but in the city you might not have had that. So children had sometimes had little supervision if the rest of the family was working in a factory. Transportation, trains were just a marvel of this time period. If you can imagine when your alternatives were only walking or horses or mules or a wagon, contrast that with getting on a train and going somewhere at the crazy speed of 20 or 25 miles an hour. But I joke, but it really was a big difference and kind of unsettling, as well as being something that you might take advantage of. Religion was in conflict with some of Charles Darwin's teachings. People felt like they couldn't rely on their religion sometimes as much as they had in the past. And even within religious people, there were the traditionalists with the Church of England, there were dissenters, and there was some argument about that. So it wasn't as stable as it had been in the past. The biggie in Victorian times was morality. What was proper? Is this the proper dress to wear at this time of day? If you're in the middle class, you had a dress that you wore in the morning, which was completely different from an evening dress if you went out at night to a play, for example. There was a lot of repression. People weren't supposed to have certain urges. There was guilt associated with what they called vices that today probably wouldn't get a second look or a second glance. Prostitution for women that couldn't make a living any other way. Uh, the idea that your reputation could be ruined by something as simple as going out with, if you're a woman going out with a man for a few minutes for a walk without a chaperone. Again, this is more middle and upper class. Things were perhaps not as uh, rigidly enforced or do among the lower classes. Sigmund Freud, towards the end of the century, is proposing some different ways about thinking about the human mind that led people to wonder about themselves and about others, the id, the ego, the superego, which of those is in control of me at any given moment. The feeling that time was speeding up, and I feel that we're very familiar with that, that if you knew how to use a certain type of software a couple of years ago and you haven't used it for a while and you get back in, you're like, wait a minute, this looks nothing like it did 2 years ago. It just seems that time is moving so quickly that it's hard for a human being to keep up. The slums in cities, there was a lot of disease and things that we take for granted, like running water in the house, much less a bathtub or a toilet, were luxuries either of the very, very rich or some of the upper middle class. But I was just reading in this book, The Victorian Home, that in London, it wasn't till the last quarter of the 19th century that running water was common in wealthy and middle class homes. Before that, servants were going out to the nearest standpipe or well and bringing buckets of water back to the house to wash people, to wash dishes, to wash clothes. A lot of places had a privy in the backyard instead of a toilet, to be blunt. And a lot of the poorer people didn't have their own privy, they had to share. So you can imagine the types of diseases that would spread under those conditions. On the positive side, more people could read than ever before, and literacy rates during the Victorian era, by the end of it, were up in the 90th percentile. So that's marvelous. That's a brave new world indeed when so many people can read. So the novel rises as a genre. People are reading novels rather than so much in books. Yes, you could get a book, but they were expensive. People would read in installments in newspapers and magazines. And you might have heard that Charles Dickens, one of the big novelists of the time, that's how he rose to fame, was through installments. People couldn't wait to read the next chapter of a book that he had put out. I'd also like to mention that sometimes literature was used to advocate for change or pointed out moral causes. Think about A Christmas Carol. Most of us are familiar with the story in A Christmas Carol, and we recognize that we're called upon by the characters there to help the poor, to help people that are disabled, like Tiny Tim. So there is more of a spreading of that discussion of what should we do to help our fellow man. There's more realism, and but at the same token, people use literature as an escape, just like we use our favorite TV shows today to kind of get away from life for a while and look at somebody else's problems. Literature served that same function for people in the Victorian era. Here's a few terms I'd like you to familiarize yourself with. A couple of them or more you already know, I'm sure. An apothecary is similar to what we call a pharmacist nowadays. Didactic refers to people teaching. So in Tiny Tim, the author is trying to teach us that we should care for people that have less than we do. Repression, the last word on the list, means kind of stifling your feelings and keeping them hidden. So keep those terms in mind moving forward.